for you? And if so, how do I submit a successful application? The other thing, unless you've been under a rock the last week, you know that the American Rescue Plan was signed into an act last week. And I literally spent all weekend kind of going through it and pulling out programs that I thought were, again, very interesting and high impact. Some are discretionary, some are allocations, but we have a very good feel of, how much money there is, who it's targeted towards, what activities it funds, that sort of thing. So if you'd like more detail on that, we only have an hour today. We're not going to cover that, but we're certainly happy to share that information with you. Andy, next slide, please. So we're going to kick off the webinar. We're going to start broadly and then get narrow and then go into a panel discussion. But I'm so excited to have Russ Elliott with us today. He's the director of the Washington State Broadband Office and has just tremendous experience with broadband programs in general. So Russ, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Well, thanks, Cheryl. It's cool to be here on the warm-up band, obviously, for this good group of this good information seminar that we're going to have here. I think many of you have seen the little dog and pony. I'll run through here. It's really cool to see a lot of my friends and coworkers and folks that I work with on a regular basis in this up there in the attendee list. So welcome everyone, and I'm glad you guys could make it, because it really is a critical time for us to really take advantage of what I think is going to be a once in a generation type opportunity to actually make a difference in the broadband infrastructure play here. We have unprecedented money. You guys have heard me say this over and over again, broken record, and it's time that we really make a big difference. A lot of this that we've been doing in Washington State has helped us get here. We talked about the fact that we wanted to be the dog that caught the bus, have a bunch of shovel-ready projects in the works, so that when something like this came along, we were prepared. And I'm excited to say that I believe the strategy we stood up, the broadband office that I'll share with you here in a minute, has led to us to be prepared for this time. And so we'll go from there. So Andy, next slide, please. My name is Russ. I'm the broadband director for the state of Washington, as everybody knows. You've seen this slide 1,000 times. I'm looking at who's in the list here, and most of you guys have seen this like 800 times. So this is the commerce. This is our commerce slide. I sit in between commerce and the governor's office, and because commerce does such good work, we put this kind of commerce commercial at the front of our slide deck to let you know that we do a lot of good work here in the state of Washington. So next slide, please. So as we're all aware, broadband is today broadband is a community up discussion. It's a door-to-door, street-to-street conversation. No longer can we talk shape files or census blocks and those kind of things. We've seen the error of those ways, and we have to get down to the street level. We've got to get real focused on this. And in order to do that, we have to empower those communities. Oh, somebody needs to mute. Thank you. So in order to do that, we have to really start to embrace that community up discussion. The broadband office has done that. This is our support model. This is the way we do it here in the state. We start with the partnership level. We've partnered with Washington State University. Broadband action teams are becoming a mainstay in this state. We've got over 30 of them now in this state. So we're really organizing those communities, getting the right people at the table, making certain we're fostering good discussions. Then we're at those levels, they're starting to say, hey, these are the areas we're feeling pain. From that, we start to look at, okay, if you feel pain, let's see if we can't develop a plan around those pain points. And then with the planning and the technical feasibility work comes the funding. And it's never been more critical than to partner with people that have expertise in this space. And I'm going to sound like I'm on the board of directors for LDA, but I'm going to tell you right now, this group has been fantastic for us. It's been an amazing partnership to have a proven group at the table with us during this critical time where we don't have an opportunity to learn and try to fumble our way through it. We have to bring experts to the table so that we can win. Washington State's never been good at going out and getting funds for broadband infrastructure. We're going to change that. We want to really make certain we get our share and then some, not just a little bit of it, right? So we've never been having good success. I'm proud to announce that this last round of Community Connect, we ended up with 6 or 7 applications out of here where usually the state gets 1 or 0. So proud of the work that's getting done. A lot of that comes to the fact that we're partnering with the right people. So bring those partners to the table, identify those funds, build the infrastructure to the state goals. Washington State's got a pretty aggressive, lofty moonshot goal. We're 150 symmetrical by 2028. We want to support that we continue to build infrastructure that's going to meet that type of capacity, that future-proof, scalable infrastructure. And then the end, the thing that's hyper focused on right now is this digital equity and inclusion. So this is the thing that kind of caps it all off, that once you get the infrastructure there, you need to make certain people have the tools, they have the training, and they can afford it. And that's, we're seeing a lot of this ARPA money and a lot of the other monies that are coming down to really start to address those affordability metrics. I think we're going to see some really good work there coming out of the federal government. State government's doing the same thing. We're talking about it here in our legislature. So next slide, please. Everybody knows that's not been under a rock here in Washington State, that we stood up a broadband mapping initiative where we're doing crowdsourcing, and we're really starting to identify specifically where there's areas of need. This map that we have stood up here at broadband.wa.gov allows us to start to tell a story. You can start to see that the numbers are starting to really reflect what's going on in the state. We are seeing that we have infrastructure. Most places have something, but is that something adequate? We're finding that a lot of what we have is not adequate. So we're going to have to really start to focus on that building part that says, let's continue to look at building that future-proof, scalable infrastructure. And here in Washington State, obviously, we're having a lot of conversations about public networks, private networks. I contend it's somewhere in the middle, that we've got to get these public-private partnerships working together. We've got to get that open access stuff going. It's proving itself out in the state. We need to continue to do that. But the only way we're going to do that is to make certain that people in these communities show where their pains are. We have to be specific. We can't talk in general terms. So if somebody says their internet's crappy, you can't quantify that. What you got to tell them to do, go onto the map, give me what crappy means, so I can define it, I can quantify it, and I can start to address it in a better way. So that's what we've done here with the map. So next slide, please. Lots of funds. I'm not going to talk a lot here because this is going to get talked about here pretty soon. But obviously USDA is going to have a bunch of money. NTIA's got a bunch of money. FCC is going to sit on a bucket of money as well. There's going to be EDA's got a bunch of money. And we've got all these rescue plans, the different things that are coming out, and then obviously the accessible, affordable internet for all that's out there with Clyburn on the East Coast right now. We're seeing $94 billion that are getting thrown into a bucket that potentially will come into infrastructure and the DEI programs here relatively soon. So we have to get ourselves prepared. We have to be talking intelligently about the problem. We have to start to quantify the ask. So that's what we're doing here. Next slide. Ding. See, ding works. Thanks. So the other thing I think we need to do better than because historically, as a country, we are not doing a good job holding ourselves accountable. We continue to see programs that are coming in short on their deliverables with regard to, you've been awarded funds, you've been awarded a subsidy, and you continue to not deliver, yet you continue to receive funds. We have to start to measure accountability. We have to start to make certain things are getting done. We've got a lot of folks here in Eastern Washington that are suffering because we've got slow roll on some of the CAF monies that are out there. We've got some things that we need to do to really start to hold people accountable. So what I want to do is really, our map is there so that we can measure success. This is a picture of Frontier Air Park, which is in Snohomish County, which we were successful at partnering them with a solution that will eventually solve this problem. It just got announced 2 weeks ago. But you see the dots on the left, definitely unserved, less than 10 megs, a lot of people without service. The way we're going to measure success is the map will look like it does on the right. Green dots show that everybody's got well above 100 megabits. So we will be able to measure success. We will be able to define what success looks like. I think this is critical. We have to start to quantify and measure and hold folks accountable to make certain these things are getting done, because I think there's a lot of waste going on. So this is what we're doing in Washington State, and this is how people hold me accountable, right? So this will be my tool. I think that's it. Let's go to the next one. Yep, that's it. You hear my shtick. What gets measured gets done. So I'm big on that. So thank you very much. I'm gonna stick around, listen to the rest of this great information from John and the other folks, and look forward to answering questions.
Well, we're gonna pick your brain during a panel discussion. So I'd like to introduce John Holman. He's the general field rep through RUS, the Rural Utilities Services, through the USDA. And we're so excited to have him as part of this call to talk about not only RUS's telecom programs, broadband specifically, but then the Russ DLT grant, Distance Learning and Telemedicine grant, which is my favorite grant, and should be upcoming maybe in the next month. Maybe we can twist his arm and he'll tell us when. Anyway, John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of USDA, I'd like to say thank you to Learn, Design, Apply, and the Washington Broadband Office, great partners with the agency as sharing information on our programs. My name is John Holman. I'm the General Field Rep. I cover the states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We also have on the call Brian Smith. He's our Senior GFR covering the state of Arizona. We'll likely ask Brian to jump in. Next slide, please. This presentation is going to be just a real high level, just an intro to a number of programs, but need to mention that under the canvas of USDA, there's a number of sub-agencies. One of those that you might be familiar with is Rural Development, whose focus is economic development. They have a whole different suite of programs under business and industry, community facilities, wastewater, electric, and we have current memorandum of understanding between Rural Development and the Rural Utilities Service that 10% of funds out of all programs should have a focus on broadband. So USDA really does have broadband at the forefront as a priority. Next slide, please. Next slide. To give you some ideas in regards to the level of funding under the Rural Utility Service telecommunication programs, you can see here about $8.3 billion over 10 years since fiscal year 2010. We had a broadband initiatives program, often referred to as BIP, that had about $2.9 billion for that program. One program that I'll talk about is Reconnect program. It's starting to gain traction with about 1.3 billion thus far, but that kind of gives you some idea as to the level of funding. Now, each of our programs funding is on a national level for those funds. Next slide, please. It's important to note that we do have a focus on tribal investments, about 20.3 million over those 10-year, between fiscal year 2018 and 19, which is a good amount of funding for our programs for tribal investments. Sometimes there's an opportunity for a priority with working with tribes. Next slide, please. So under the Rural Utilities Service telecommunication programs, we really have 4 core programs. The one that we have is our infrastructure loan program. It's been around since the 1940s. When we started to get telephone to the rural communities. That program right now is currently well funded, and we kind of put it into projects for broadband currently. The other program, Reconnect, which is a pilot program, is kind of taking center stage out of these programs because it's recently been rolled out through phases. You'll often now hear about that program being referred to as e-connectivity program. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We have a couple of true grant programs. One is Community Connect that Russ mentioned. Community Connect is an opportunity, plus our distance learning and telemedicine grant, which is really the focus of this meeting, which is a telecommunication program. Next slide, please. So with the infrastructure program, some of the benefits, and it's real specific to working with telephone companies and incumbent local exchange carriers, is that it's at the cost of money. The interest rates are incredibly low. You wouldn't find that in the private lending. We have the ability with an infrastructure loan to defer payments so that you can get this broadband network built out before you had to start meeting expenses. That's a real benefit. We can extend the term of the loan, which could help pencil out on a potential project, but we typically fund those projects for the life of the facility. We'd like to hear from you if you're interested in an infrastructure loan. It's not only for build out of broadband networks, but it's used for making improvements to current infrastructure. So that program is well funded, about 690 million currently per fiscal year. We don't even come close to spending those dollars. We don't have any really loans in the pipeline right now, so we're aggressively outreaching the infrastructure loan program. Next slide, please. So Reconnect is the pilot program that's been rolled out in phases. It's through the Consolidation Appropriations Act, phase 1 and 2. Phase 1 was 600 million available, and phase 2, 550 million. We look forward to another round of funding to come around in June or July of this year. So right now is a good time to be in conversations around Reconnect. One of the check boxes on eligibility for the program is that the program is really designed to provide broadband to rural communities where there isn't sufficient access, typically defined at 10 megabits downstream, 1 megabit upstream, and that is terrestrial-based broadband with a focus on residential. We do have some build-out requirements, 25.3. Most of the projects that we see through this program are fiber, so we're meeting those build-out requirements. But it's just important to note June or July is the next funding opportunity, and we'd like to discuss a potential project for Reconnect. Next slide, please. So Reconnect, there are a couple different options. It's either a loan or a grant or both. If it's a loan, you can go up to 50 million per project. Those interest rates are set at 2%. The grant is up to 25 million. Doesn't mean that you have to reach those numbers. We do fund some smaller projects, and we'd be looking at either grant loan combo at 25 each for the grant and loan. That's kind of a 50-50 between the loan and grant. Who can apply for Reconnect is pretty broad. We do like to get into the discussion around ownership to make sure that whoever's applying for Reconnect funds has the ability to own, operate, and maintain that. I know in Washington State, that's oftentimes the initial discussions with utilities who are starting to see the program as an opportunity for being in the broadband space. Next slide, please. So Community Connect, as I mentioned, is a smaller grant opportunity. Russ says we do have some applications in for Washington State. We're currently under review for fiscal year 20 and 21 funds. And those combined years was about 65 million. So it was a good opportunity. The next opportunity for Community Connect will be for fiscal year 22. There have been some changes to the program on eligibility. That we do no longer consider wireless and satellite for the eligibility determination, but the same rules apply for Community Connect as they do Reconnect, no greater than 10-to-1 for fixed broadband. The only difference there is Reconnect is focused on residential, where Community Connect program is really focused on anything publicly available. There are some differences between the two programs, this one being a smaller grant opportunity for projects of 3 million or less. The rurality requirement still applies to Community Connect. I didn't mention on Reconnect, there is a match portion of 25% for any grant ask, but Community Connect, it's a 15% match requirement. So that is pretty nominal as regards to the overall cost of the project. There are some differences between the two programs, so we'd like to be in those discussions to help you find out whether Community Connect might be an opportunity or Reconnect, or perhaps both as those funding opportunities come up. Reconnect can be multiple areas. Community Connect has to be one contiguous area. Next slide, please. So distance learning telemedicine is a grant program that we have. It's important to note that this is a telecommunication program where you're looking for funding to cover the cost of equipment to be able to communicate between different user sites. So the maximum grant amount for this program is 1 million. So we for fiscal year 21 went through a couple of funding rounds. It was kind of unique to how the program was rolled out last fiscal year. We had about 72 million for round one and about 41 million for round two. But we realized that there was a tremendous demand due to COVID-19, and we got quite a bit of applications, so it was well oversubscribed. So a lot of projects weren't funded, but we did have some successes with the last funding round. Now, next funding opportunity, we're told that it's going to come out this month or in the month of April. So this is the next program that's on deck, and that funding opportunity announcement will be posted to grants.gov So we need to be in those conversations now if you have a potential project. Next slide, please. This is a slide that kind of gives you a definition of distance learning or telemedicine. It has to be one or the other. It could be a mix of different things that you're doing in both categories. We just want to know for your project specific, what is the predominant use of the project? And Dana will talk a little bit more about the requirements on what might be eligible. Next slide, please. Here is the scoring criteria. Dana, I'll leave that to Dana to talk a little bit more about this, but special consideration is around the area of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. We also have some special consideration for substance abuse disorder, or perhaps maybe your project falls into an opportunity zone. But when we get into those discussions, we need to really focus on how your project might score, and that's all laid out in the funding opportunity. Next slide, please. So the application requirements, there's a number of certifications that you go through. You're going to complete a number of attachments. As I mentioned, the funding opportunity is going to be posted through grants.gov, but there is a URL website there that you can sign up for notices. It's not posted through the Federal Register, but if you sign up with that Gov delivery system, you should get notified of that funding opportunity. Next slide, please. Some assistance provided by the agency. We're really good at responding to your initial inquiry. As I mentioned, Brian Smith is on the Zoom meeting here. So there's a list of GFRs on a website, depending on the state to which you operate. It could be multiple states. There is a DLT mailbox that goes straight to Washington, D.C. They're really good at responding to questions that you have on the program. The benefit to using that and sending your question to Washington, D.C. is we create frequently asked questions, and maybe it's a question that you haven't that we haven't received before that needs to be addressed. There's also a phone number to our national office staff. But the best good point to go to is the application guide on our website. That is kind of a comprehensive list of all the requirements of the program, how to apply. Also have a number of checks. So if you were to contact or we would probably refer you to that. Next slide, please. So here are some contacts with our national office. We have a number of people in DC that run different divisions. They're happy to hear from you about what's going on in your state for the rural community. I just wanted to provide that to you. Next slide, please. And here is our contact information. As you see here, Brian Smith is number 1, and I'm number 2. So Brian.Smith1 at USDA and John.Holman2 at USDA.gov. We're here to help you navigate the application process. There's quite a bit of information to get through when you craft a proposal, but more importantly, to identify the program for your potential project. So do appreciate it. I'll turn it back over to you, Cheryl.
Awesome.
Thank you.
No, thanks so much, John. And we're going to look forward to talking more with you and Brian when we get to the panel discussion. So I'm going to hand it off to Dana Satterwhite, who's one of our resident experts on grants and how to put together successful applications. And, you know, last year, I think it was last year, 2 years ago, maybe, the pandemic has blurred everything for me, but we as the company decided to take an approach. It was kind of a teach a man to fish approach to saying, let us give you advice on how to put together your Russ DLT application, because it's a little bit difficult. There's lots of moving parts and stuff, and we gave these free workshops. They're vendor agnostic, just anybody who wanted to come. We gave these workshops across the country, and they were generally like 5 or 6 hours long. So Dana gets 15 minutes to to hit the highlights. So Dana, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Cheryl. And thanks, John and Russ, for presenting. And I'll just reiterate what John said, that we're just really lucky to have resources on today's call like John and Brian for this grant in particular. And then, of course, Russ for broadband related questions. And I'll get into this a little bit more, but going to your general field reps for questions and assistance and guidance around some of these programs, but in particular, this upcoming Russ DLT grant. They're great resources and they are here to be your advocate and to help walk you through the process. Additionally, as Cheryl said, our team is available to sort of walk you through some best practices. Today, I'm going to do a crash course because we don't have much time, but I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive beyond the basics that John just highlighted of this program. And as John mentioned, it's coming out very soon. So we wanted to just give you some basic tips and tricks that we've learned over the past years on what works really well in this program and what helps you as applicants become as competitive as you can possibly be. Next slide, please, Andy. John highlighted, the priority of this program. It's all about bridging the digital divide. The key emphasis here is that definition of distance learning and telemedicine being those real-time connections. This grant is all about funding the technology and equipment needed in order to provide these services via technology to the most rural and underserved communities. Next slide, please. So John touched on this, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail just on how to really maximize your score. The major grant components that are attached to your actual score are just the objective scoring portion and the subjective scoring portion. The objective scoring is what you can really control. It's what you know going into the application. You can basically bank on these points if you can maximize these sections. So our number one tip for you is to maximize your objective score if you can. And this is where you're really going to focus on the communities your project is serving being the most rural communities in our country, and going by that scoring matrix. And as you saw from John's numbers in the last rounds of funding, it's a highly competitive grant. So this objective score is really what you know you can control going into the application process. So you really want to target for your project, including only the sites that are very rural and are high poverty. And if you can get those special consideration points that John mentioned, you're really going to set yourself up for success. And then that subjective scoring section, your needs and benefits section, which I'll cover in depth in a few minutes, is really the only scored section of your narrative. So it's the part where you really want to focus your energy and your time on telling your story and really explaining to that grant reviewer why you need these funds and what they really will bring to the communities that you serve. And I'll touch a little bit on the other sections because they're equally important, though they are not scored. The required sections of this grant are one of those things that, if many of you have applied for grants before, you can work really, really hard on your narrative, but if you miss one of the required pieces, like some paperwork or a form, you can get disqualified and no one will actually read all that hard work you put together. So I'm going to go through some of the tips and tricks on how to not miss some of those key pieces, but also how to prioritize your time and make sure that you're setting yourself up for the most competitive application that you can. Next slide, please. So like I said, maximizing your objective score is our tip number one for you in this program. The first steps in doing this are really understanding who are you trying to serve, who are your project partners, where are they located? You as a hub, potentially as the applicant, could be in an urban area, which is acceptable in this grant program, but you want to make sure that you're serving the most rural and underserved communities. So identifying those project partners and those locations that you want to include in your project are the first step for understanding if you are going to have a competitive application. We can help walk you through some of the resources. John mentioned some of those additional resources on the website to help you start that scoring process, but where you can go into the census websites and the mapping tools and understand how rural are the sites you're serving, what does their poverty score look like, and then of course factoring in what additional services in your project can maybe get you those special consideration points. Then you'll know your score going into the application process. So again, that's kind of your number one step. Next slide, please. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about this. As I mentioned, the needs and benefits section is your only scored subjective section. So we really emphasize spending your time and your energy in this section. And we have a couple of tips and tricks and strategies on how to structure this section to make sure that a reviewer really understands how you're positioning the needs that the communities you're serving are facing, how the technology and how your project will propose to benefit and serve these communities, and what your hopeful and proposed outcomes are going to look like as a result of this grant funding. So again, tell your story. What is unique about the project that you're proposing? What are unique about the demographics, the population you're serving? Maybe there's some geographic challenges faced in those communities where bringing resources in via telemedicine or distance learning truly are the only options for bringing access to these types of services to those communities. Really touch on that emotion tied to these, needs in these communities, and really how your project is going to change the lives of those community members, and really how it's going to make a huge difference. This is your chance to tell that story and really stand out as unique as what is specifically challenging about where you're serving and the population you're serving. If you go to the next slide, I'll kind of show how we suggest that you highlight it. You want to show your process in this section. You want to show how you came to the details of your proposal. Did you involve community members as you were looking at this application, saying, hey, I think this could be a good opportunity for us to bring some resources into our communities? Include that information, those conversations you had with community members. Include letters of support and surveys. If you've consulted with John Holman or Brian Smith, if you've had those conversations and kind of started to float this idea, include some of that information, because it shows due diligence and it shows that you've really taken a look at what your problems in the communities you serve are and what you think will help address those challenges. These are just some examples of needs and use cases. And Andy, if you go to the next slide, I think I've highlighted a couple of different tables that we suggest. Again, you want to make sure that you're communicating these needs, the potential benefits and outcomes really clearly to a grant reviewer. And we suggest putting something together like a table that goes with your narrative. So tell your story and then really outline it clearly. Talk about the need, and then talk about what that potential benefit is that addresses that need. And then talk about a measurable outcome that you can anticipate coming from the project that you're proposing, and make it really clear throughout your narrative. I often refer to this as, in high school when you do that 5-paragraph essay exercise where you really want it to be clearly outlined. Make it really clear to that grant reviewer what your mission is and what you're hoping to accomplish through your project. Next slide, please. So again, the difference between what we view, benefits and outcomes. Your needs you want to address in the beginning, say, here are my needs. And then you want to explain what your proposed benefits are. How do you think that these will benefit and impact the community in a positive way? Really discuss those. And then outcomes, as opposed to benefits, are going to be more measurable and specific. So you want to give really specific information about what you think you can predict as an outcome as a result of this project. Use numbers and data if you have it. For example, if it's a telemedicine application, talk about the patients you're able to serve now and maybe the number of patients you'll be able to serve as a result of this project. Patients you might not have as easy access to right now without the technology that you're proposing in your budget. Next slide, please. And then these other components of your needs and benefits section are equally important. You want to show that project support, community support letters, donations from local community businesses or organizations or project partners, showing support and approval, whether it's your board or a vote or just community coming together for a meeting saying we are fully in support and we back this project. We understand the benefits that could come to us from this project. And then again, that alignment with the state plan, talking with Russ and with John and with Brian, wherever you're located, understanding what the needs are for your state, what priorities the state has around distance learning and telemedicine and telecommunications in general, making sure that you kind of tie your project to that state's long-term vision and plan are really good to highlight. And then they want you to make sure you're addressing, if you have done a DLT grant before or you participated in one, just make sure you're identifying why this one is different. You're not duplicating anything that you've done in past projects. And if you have been involved, just explain what your involvement was, what the status of that involvement is, and where you're at in that project. And again, how this one is different and expanding in different ways. Next slide. And I won't read through this entire slide, but it's just to give you a visual of examples of the different types of projects that our group has seen. This is not the only list of potential projects. Really, the opportunities are endless as long as you're using the technology for some form of distance learning, training, or education, providing those services, in telemedicine, even healthcare education and community education. If you're using technology to deliver those services to rural and underserved areas, you are in line with what this grant is all about. So again, this is just to paint a picture of the types of projects we see at that bottom one, state and local organizations. That's a big one that I think sometimes gets missed in this program, because when we hear distance learning and telemedicine, we think schools and hospitals. State and local government organizations have training and education needs, especially now looking through the pandemic needs that our communities are facing for community education, public communication and education, corrections facilities, judicial space. There's really a lot of different ways that this grant can be leveraged and really help benefit rural and underserved communities. So be creative and think broadly about how the technology can serve the communities that you are hoping to reach. Next slide, please. Next tip is just be aware of what those pieces are that can get you disqualified without every viewer ever getting to read that very well researched needs and benefits section. Those paperwork requirements, you do need to contact with your state director. You can work with your general field rep to understand that. There's also lots of good resources on the website to help you understand who you need to reach out to and what needs to be included. Compliance, those are forms that sometimes get put off to the last minute, and if you don't have a signature on them and if you haven't done them completely, they can be deal breakers. So you want to make sure that you're reading through those guidelines letter by letter and making sure you're following them so closely. And they change slightly every year. As John mentioned, there's some scoring changes to be expected in this next round. So really make sure you look at the most current guidelines and you're following them to the letter. Little things like your match letters, adding up to the correct amounts, your budget going to the exact right amount. Those are really important details in this grant to make sure that you've really done your due diligence. I think the last item on this slide really says it all. Don't be the only person to have read through your grant by the end of it. When you hit submit, at least have a couple other people have read through it, because it takes so much energy to put all these pieces together that you can assume you've done something and just believe you've done it without having someone check your work. So we always recommend having someone look through it, kind of check through the guidelines, check against the checklist that they provide for you to make sure that you're hitting every single mark. Because if you miss a section, you can be deemed ineligible. And as John mentioned, this grant is so competitive that they can't give everyone, second and third chances to resubmit and reevaluate. So you want to get it right the very first time. And then the last tip that I have for you all is just to start the process early. As John mentioned, we expect this grant to come out very soon. There are things that you can do to prepare for this grant even before the guidelines come out. Some of them are as simple as just making sure that your SAM.gov and grants.gov registrations are active. You know how to access the tools. You have the right people lined up for those credentials. Those are things you can look at right now. John mentioned the grant will hit grants.gov. That's also where you submit this grant application. So you just want to make sure that you have those registrations up and running and ready to go. It can take a couple of weeks if you haven't done that yet. So that's something very easy to get going on before the grant even comes out. And then starting to think about your proposal and your project needs, your project partners, all of those things you can think about right away. You don't need the guidelines to start to understand what are the challenges you're hoping to address, what are the needs the communities have that you serve. Those are all things you can start lining up, including some of your budget needs. What technology are you looking at to help solve those problems? What does it cost? What does your budget potentially look like? Again, those are things that you can talk through with your community members and your project partners before you even start reading through those guidelines. And then lastly, start having conversations with your general field reps. They're great resources, as I mentioned, and they can help guide you through this process along the way. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl. Like I said, we have so much more information than I was able to go through today on sort of what makes for a strong application. So please feel free to reach out to us if you'd like a little bit more information on this program or other grant programs out there. And we'd be happy to walk you through some of our best practices and other tricks that we've learned along the way with this program and others. So be happy to share those with you. So please feel free to follow up with us following today's session.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Dana. Really great advice. And I'm really excited about this next section, maybe more than all the other stuff that's already come before, because I love when we get into discussions, right? So I'm going to throw a couple of discussion points out there, and I'd like our panelists, or frankly, anyone who wants to chime in, please feel free. So first one here, we've talked a lot about great sources for funding, and I personally think I've seen that over the years, sometimes the organizations who need funding the worst, like they have the highest poverty, they serve the most disenfranchised area, maybe they're small and strapped for resources, those are often the organizations who have a lot of barriers in place to get access to those funds. So maybe, they don't have enough match, or they don't, have the funding available to hire a grant writer. They don't know how to write the grant themselves. So Russ, I'd like to start with you. Have you seen these types of barriers in the state of Washington or in other states, that you've worked in? And if so, have you found strategies for addressing that type of barrier?
Yeah, that's a great question. Every state that I've worked in, that is the barrier, right? And so I'm the obstacle is the way kind of guy. So the first thing I think about is, okay, how do we mitigate those? And in Washington State, what we've done, and I've gotten through the first hurdle of budget considerations for this year that are going in place in July, is we have technical assistance funding now through the office. We have grant writing assistance through the office, and we will have, hopefully, if everything goes well, matching funds. So I think what we're doing is we're building the no excuses model here. We're going to try to get rid of all those barriers that everybody throws at you. And the next thing we have to do is make certain that we are communicating with the communities, we're educating them, empowering them, and encouraging them. These are the things that we have to do. So if we do that and we remove the barriers, we should be having success, shouldn't we?
That's amazing. Yeah, I love that approach. Okay, I know we have a limited time. I'm going to jump to the next topic. So I wanted to talk about broad impact of the types of projects that we've talked about today. So the grant funding, it's just money, right? What's really important is the stories that come after it. It's kind of like, Russ, your map where you kind of went from red and yellow to green, 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 right? You want to see the impact. And I think it's more than just, oh, there's broadband over here and there's distance learning over there. I think where these things converge is where you really see the goodness and the excitement. So I would just love for John, maybe you and Brian want to chime in and talk about some of the impact you've seen from some of these programs, but anybody's welcome to chime into the discussion.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Yes, we always try to springboard off the successes of past funding, and perhaps maybe reaching out to the past funded awardees on some best practices. For instance, we just recently funded for University of Washington $1 million for their School of Dentistry. So now people in the rural communities can learn how to become dentists. And that's not just in Washington State. They have sites in Montana as well. We funded a project for Cochise Technology District in Arizona around mental and social health for our rural communities. So some really good projects that are funded, but a lot of projects, as Dana had mentioned, are not funded. And it's been my experience that if you're not funded, let's try it again for the next funding round. Perhaps maybe if the project is still viable, that they want to make some adjustments, because as we all know, those funding levels are anticipated, and we really don't know what those levels of funding are going to be until we get that funding opportunity announcement. But really kind of maybe working with partnerships. A lot of the successes have been from universities and colleges who are really good at doing this kind of thing. Perhaps maybe they have some input, but I'll turn it over to Brian Smith. Maybe Brian has some further comment on that.
Hey everyone, good morning. I'm in a little bit of a casual mode here today, so you're only going to see my big fat head. But what I want to say is, one of my favorite projects I saw was it was in Page, Arizona, and it was a health clinic. And what they did was they added counseling services through DLT through a telemedicine program. And it was cool because I went to go check up on the project and see how it was going. And I went out there and like, you know what, we're actually in between sessions, come in here. And they let me sit down in this really comfortable chair. And there's a counselor on the other end. And she was actually, I think it was near Boston is where the counselor actually was, but she contracted with them. And, we went through some of the different questions I had, but, in her experience, people actually found it easier to talk to someone remotely. Whereas me, I would think it would be the opposite personally, but, it turned out that it actually put people at ease not to be in the same room with the person. And so, that's something that the kind of thing that maybe is thinking out of the box. And then they decided to use it to test for counseling those with opioid issues and just expand it. Another one we did, which was really cool, was in the state of New Mexico. I cover New Mexico as well. And in New Mexico, the Santa Fe Indian School started a program where they were able to teach languages to those in the actual pueblos to learn to speak their actual native languages. And so, it just expanded. They would put remote places in the libraries in those pueblos, and the people from the Santa Fe Indian School were able to actually hold classes and teach people their language that has sadly started to be lost. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of programs I really I get excited about it.
Yeah, they're exciting, right? I say this all the time. It's not about the technology or whatever it is you're putting in the budget, right? It's not about the money. It's not about the technology. It's about all the great things that come from making those connections and expanding access for people, right? And it's hard to imagine the lack of access to resources that people in more urban areas take for granted, right? And I think we've seen during the pandemic just the critical need. I mean, the homework gap existed before the pandemic, but certainly it became like front and center, just the same way telehealth did. As a result of the pandemic, all of a sudden we're seeing changes in licensure and reimbursement and all those things that stood in the way of full-blown telehealth. So I think it's an exciting time, and we're just going to see more and more demand, and that's what makes programs like this so important. Russ, do you want to chime in on impact you've seen in communities as a result of these programs?
Well, and that's I threw a little thought, and I'm sorry, I said Melissa, it's Marissa. I'm sorry, Marissa. The one of the things that I think we need to talk about is what are the examples of the wins? What do the successes look like? And you can take out the names so that the people can be protected or whatever. But I am still, even in my position, a little bit mystified on how DLT applies, where we can best use it. So if we can have more examples of, just like we just heard, here's a cool one here, this is one how it worked there, and then we can then talk about it internally, because I meet with a lot of healthcare folks here in the state, and we sit down a lot of times and say, I'm not sure, I think it's for equipment, this kind of stuff. So to have the better examples of, here's one that really worked well, here's a unique way, here's a common way, those kind of things. So I don't have great examples because I haven't been on the forefront of that.
Dana's got some good examples. Go, Dana.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Russ. I think, I mentioned when you hear distance learning or telemedicine, we get trapped into thinking that means a school to school or a hospital to patient, and it's pretty narrow. And so I agree, we want to hear these examples of what has worked well that might not be, just those examples that come straight to mind. One of the projects I loved working on last year was a Department of Corrections, a state Department of Corrections that already had decided that they needed to start bringing healthcare services for their inmates via technology, just because the costs were so high for transporting. There were costs associated and risk associated with taking officers out of the facilities to do those transports. So financially and sort of safety wise, they were already seeing a need for those services. And then bam, COVID hits right as they're sending in their application for telemedicine for a DLT project for the state Department of Corrections. And then they thought, oh my gosh, we can't even get physicians into our facilities right now because it's a COVID issue. And so it was one of those examples where it was already kind of a unique, but very, very qualified example of where this is a perfect fit. And then of course, COVID added to that, and made them even more, made it more critical for them to figure out how to make this work. And it was already on their long-term plan. So it was a perfect kind of segue for them where they knew it was going to save them costs and security issues in the future. And then with COVID, they realized really quickly that they were not prepared for a situation like that. And it was just the best thing that could happen when they got that award notification, because they really saw real time the need for it. So I loved that project just because it was recent, and it also had, it was just such a good example of the benefits of telemedicine into a facility like that. And then, you add COVID to the mix and it was just like, oh my gosh, we need this immediately.
Yeah. I think I know that one you're talking about, Dana, because I was covering that state at the time.
Yeah,
But
you were.
the other thing too is that it doesn't have to be like, people think distance learning. Distance learning can be something else. Distance learning can be offering training to people in a remote work area. It could be education for maybe those in the community who don't have a high school diploma and they want to go get a GED. I mean, it's really limitless as to what it can be. If it's educating people, it's distance learning. And so, you can really open your mind and expand your thoughts. I mean, yes, we think of it in terms of schools. We think of it in terms as remote medical, which is, they're both extremely important, but it can be other things. You can think outside the box and make your program what you think it should be.
Totally agree. As
sure.
long
I
as you
think
can
that's-
explain those benefits to a community that currently does not have access to those services, and you're using technology to help deliver those services, absolutely.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add something too, because I know we're on short on time, but I just wanted to say, when Dana really hit on it. And I think we've done a presentation before where we kind of both get excited about the needs and benefits section. I cannot express enough the importance of making it clear in your opening why you didn't get the points maybe in the SAPE scores, for example, where you're looking at school lunches. I mean, let's look at Washington State. I lived there for a long time. I know that you can have a county that has a lot of money, but there's still going to be those who, those numbers are skewed because there's still those who are unfortunate. So you gather some other numbers, gather some information, put it in a table like Dana was talking about, so you can prove quickly to the reviewer that you should qualify for needs and benefits because the county maybe is overall maybe a richer county, but that doesn't mean that these people are not being left behind. I just wanted to add that. It's
Such a good point.
hot button for me. Yeah.
No, really a good point. So we have 4 minutes left. So if anybody has a question they want us to answer, go ahead and put it in the chat box. Really quickly, I want to lob something at you, Russ, and certainly Brian and John chime in. But something I hear all the time when we talk about broadband programs is the data that you have to use when you put your project together and how, maybe the national broadband map isn't as accurate as it could be. So I'm being politically correct here. So have you all found ways to get around that issue? Because nobody wants to spend time pulling together one of these big applications only to get their project disqualified upon review because now there's a challenge period or now there's speed testing and they go, oh, well, sorry, we told you to use that map, but inaccurate, right? So anybody care to address that?
I'll touch that one. I like it. It's
Okay.
fun.
Okay.
So I first want to say that the Rural Utility Service, when we review these, we do not use the FCC 477 data to determine whether an area is eligible. So if whoever big provider is saying they're providing something and legitimately they're not, we're going to go out there. You can still submit an application, but obviously an application can be costly. But we're still going to go out there and we're going to do what's called a SAV or service area validation and figure out what's in the area. We're creating more and more sources to do that. So we have some other sources that we're able to look at and we can go and look and see what speed tests have been run by people in the area. And from that, we can kind of create what we're kind of calling hot zones and figure out what might actually be in an area. So when we go out there and do a physical visit, we look at what infrastructure is in there. Maybe they have copper pedestals and they don't have any fiber in the area. We know that speeds are only going to be, we can guesstimate what kind of speeds they might be getting locally. And, what might be lacking. Maybe a wireless provider comes in and says, oh, no, I'm providing in that area. Well, maybe we go in the area and we don't see a single, CPE on a house in that area. So we're going to do an investigation and try and figure out what's legitimately in the area. And that's why we give you that little bit of that threshold of that 10% could still overlap and be served.
Cheryl, if I could just add to that real quick, what
Yeah.
Brian was saying, the state map that we have was useful, and I think John will testify to the fact that, given the fact that he couldn't travel up to Canada and the Point Roberts area, they were able to look at our map and use that data for verification of the recent award we have here in the state. I did have a success in Wyoming as well with similar type map where I challenged the FCC map. USDA came in, looked at it, and the community was awarded in an area that otherwise the FCC showed as served. So it can be done. Again, the critical importance of us gathering that data, because then I can go and influence Brian and John and those folks and say, hey, look, we've got the data, here it is. Let's talk more matter of fact around, quantifiable information. So even more reasons why we got to continue to collect the data and be good at it locally.
That's great feedback. And I mean, I think everybody wants to fund these projects. It's not that somebody's going, oh, let me look for a way to disqualify you, right? So it's just figuring out how to provide that data and make sure that the areas you're serving truly are meeting the definition of unserved, underserved, that sort of thing before you apply, and giving the reviewers enough information to go, yes, I agree with you. So sorry, we are out of time. This has been such a great discussion, and we're so excited that you all joined us today. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And if you thought this was useful, let us know, and we can have more of these. So I feel like we just scratched the surface. But thanks so much to Russ and John and Brian and Dana, and then all of you for joining us.